All right. Thanks today for coming back and watching the Schomburg Show. I appreciate it very much. Today is something a little different. We've been talking a lot about coronavirus and what's going on with that. And, frankly, after a while, I get a little bit tired of that. So, through my email box came a very interesting request to interview someone, and it has to do with the media. You've heard me talk about the media. I think you know my stance on the media is it concerns me what they're doing. I think that they're not what they used to be, and that's what we want to talk to our guest today about. So the guest today, his name is Bob Giles. I'm going to bring him on screen here. All right. There he is. Hey, Bob. So this is Bob
Hi,
Giles.
John.
Hi. Thanks for being on the
Hi.
show. Bob has written a book. Let me just tell you about this man so you know who we're talking about, because we're going to talk about the press, and this guy is definitely been in the press for a very long time. He's written a book called When Truth Mattered. When Truth Mattered, the Kent State shootings 50 years later. Hold that book up there, Bob, so we can see it. There it is. Nice job in writing the book. And for those of you that are wondering what we're talking about, 50 years ago on May 4th in 1970, there was the Kent State shootings where the National Guard there in Ohio. Kent State is in Kent, Ohio, just outside of Akron, just south of Cleveland. The National Guard there in 1970, for those of you too young to even know about this, I got to say, I was pretty young at the time, 50 years ago. Okay, I was a little kid, but I definitely grew up knowing about this. So the National Guard shot and killed 4 students who were protesting, and it was a real travesty in our country. And Bob was the managing editor of the Beacon Journal in Akron, and you guys came out and did the coverage. So before we get there, I just need to make sure I give you a little bit more kudos here, Mr. Giles. You were the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard from 2000 to 2011, 11 years. Wow. Before that, he had a career of nearly 40 years that included editorships at the Detroit News, Times Union, and Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, New York, and the Akron Beacon Journal, which is where he did his work at the Kent State shootings. He was also a senior vice president of the Freedom Forum and executive director of its Media Studies Center in New York City. First of all, wow, congratulations on quite a career.
Thank you very much.
Yep, and I know I'm finding you right now in Michigan, and you were just mentioning how it is still winter there, but
Still winter, yes, indeed.
Yep, spring will be coming your way. So one of the things I actually started reading your book, and it is very good. In the beginning, one of the cool things I saw about it, the Beacon Journal, where you were the managing editor during this time. Let's just paint the picture. We have this Kent State University. We have the students protesting against the Vietnam War. Correct me if any of this is wrong, because you are the man that certainly knows this. We have the students protesting, and we have the National Guard coming out to stop the protest. Is that basically the setup of this?
Well, that's true. Kent State was, oddly, was not a hotbed of student protest, unlike many of the campuses around the country who were vigorously opposing the Vietnam War. But, it was a quiet campus of 19,000 students. And when May 4th came around and they began to have their anti-war rally, maybe as many as 1,500 students, protesters, witnesses participated in that moment. Part of what was upsetting the students was not only the Vietnam War, and specifically President Nixon's decision announced the previous week to send troops into Cambodia, but the fact that the local mayor had called out the National Guard, and the students deeply resented the idea that the National Guard troops were on their campus. And when they were When the rally began on Monday, just before noon, the guardsmen were dressed for combat. They had steel helmets, they had gas masks, they had grenade launchers, they had bayonets, and they had M1 rifles, which were killer weapons. So they were dressed for combat, and they were trying to carry out an order by the governor of Ohio, who had come to Kent State on the day before, on Sunday, which said there will be no gatherings on campus permitted, peaceful or otherwise. And so the governor had come partly to take advantage of the fact that he could appear to be a tough guy and leverage his campaign for the United States Senate. And he did a couple of things that really contributed to the problem. One was that he met with the county governor, the prosecutors especially. And the prosecutor said, you must close this campus. This was on Sunday, the day before the shootings.
Okay.
You must close this campus because it's too dangerous. And the governor rejected that. And he said, if we close the campus, then people will say, well, the radicals won. So it was rejected. And you can imagine there would have been no deaths on Monday had the governor followed the prosecutor's strong advice. Then the governor made a fiery speech in which he said that the students were among the worst kind of people we harbor in America. They're worse than the Nazi brown shirts.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a speech.
It was very strong language, and he was playing to his conservative base. He was in a tough race for the U.S. Senate nomination on the Republican side, and he was running against Bob Taft from the famous Taft family.
Yep.
So, and it was a close race. So he was trying to leverage his base with some tough talk and some tough actions, and it set the stage for this terrible tragedy.
Wow. So, okay, so we have political motivations involved here. We have a race involved here. We have students who are not happy with what the government's done. They also burned down the ROTC building 2 nights before there on campus. There was an ROTC building. I guess there was buildings there for the military, or that was a university building, or what was that?
Well, the ROTC building dated back to World War II, where they housed military students.
Okay.
It was an old wooden building. The students scheduled a rally there on Saturday night, and somebody set fire to the building. And the fire department was slow to respond and seemed to be intimidated by the gathering of the students, who finally cut the fire hoses, which meant that the building burned down.
Wow. Okay.
Now, previous to that, going back to Friday after Nixon's speech, a group of students gathered on a meeting place on the campus called the Commons. Mm-hmm. And they had some shovels, and they dug a hole, and they tore a page from a textbook with the U.S. Constitution and buried it and said symbolically, Governor Nixon has committed an undeclared war. The Constitution doesn't mean anything anymore. We're gonna bury it.
Interesting.
So then Saturday was kind of a peaceful day. The president of the university was out of town. He was at an educational meeting in Iowa. And so the call to the governor to bring out the guard was made by the mayor of the city of Kent. And after the building burned down on Saturday night, the National Guard troops arrived in Kent around 9 o'clock. And these were mostly farm boys. They were very unfamiliar with campus culture, campus behavior. And so on Sunday, the governor arrived, and not only did he make this fiery speech and refused the county prosecutor's plea to close the campus. But he also took charge. In the absence of the president of the university, Governor Rhodes took charge and said,
wow.
there will be no gathering of, no assembly of students, peaceful or otherwise. And so, and then Sunday, the day before the shooting, was a warm spring day. The guardsmen and the students kind of bonded a little bit. They were playing frisbee and so on. And there was a famous incident where Allison Krauss, one of the students to be killed the next day, took a flower and put it in the barrel of one of the guardsmen's rifles and said, "Flowers are better than bullets." And that is a sentiment that has prevailed over the years, 50 years now, and it's remembered by people who still have an emotional attachment to the memory of this terrible event. And so on Monday, the National Guard began to carry out its orders from the governor. And the students had called for a rally at noon. So as noon approached, there were probably 1,500 students, many of them just curious onlookers, who gathered on the Commons, which was right next to where the ROTC building had burned. And the guardsmen, there were about 100 guardsmen and a few officers, and they began to move the crowd away from the burned out ROTC building and up the Commons, which was a slight rise where people gathered. And then at the top of the Commons, which was right next to the journalism school, there was a place called Blanket Hill. And the group went down, they marched down the school. The students were retreating, keeping a safe distance, but throwing some stones and giving them the finger. And then the guardsmen came to a fence, an athletic fence on the practice field, and they formed a picket line. And 8 of them knelt down and pointed their rifles at a single student who was standing in the middle of the field all alone with a black flag, bravely waving it at the guard. And then the guard gathered together and came back up to the crest of the hill by the journalism school building, where there was a pagoda. And if you've seen pictures of the shootings, and it's on the cover of my book, the pagoda was right there where the guardsmen turned and shot the students. And the volley lasted 13 seconds. 61 bullets were fired.
That's a lot, and that's a long time to be shooting bullets. 13 seconds. So 4 students went down and were killed. Others were injured.
9 wounded. Yes.
It's hard to imagine today something like that happening, but we definitely have our own situations, I suppose, that are happening that are egregious as well. But to have the National Guard called out and shooting down students on an American university campus, it's hard to imagine today. Now, the thrust of your book is about telling the truth in reporting correctly and accurately. And one of the things that I got out of your book at the beginning, that the journal that you worked for, the Beacon Journal, that you were the managing editor for, a mid-sized daily newspaper, had a dictum or an order purpose from the owner of the newspaper that basically says, get the truth and print it.
Absolutely.
You know, that was so refreshing to me, Bob, that, I wish we had that today. So, we don't have a ton of time, unfortunately, to discuss. I would love to talk all about what happened. I want to go back there and take a look at it myself. But tell us just briefly, when we are talking about this book and you outlining that you guys laid out what actually happened up against national news organizations reporting other things, that in the end, your news held up to history, the people checking it. You guys won a Pulitzer Prize for this. You were the real steady hand of putting forth what actually occurred. Can you talk to us a bit about that, maybe even the challenges of that?
Well, our purpose was to tell the people as well as we could what had happened. We were well prepared for this because we had covered demonstrations at Kent State for a long time. Our effort to tell the truth included disclosing all the mistakes that the governor made and basically diminishing one of the early explanations that the Guard was trying to sell, which was that there had been a sniper that had shot at the Guard, which caused them to fire. They were looking for ways to cover up the killings that their soldiers had committed,
I'm
the
sure.
murders. And so the first excuse they turned to was, well, there was a sniper. So we investigated that. We took our own shots and we showed that the bullet hole, which they were using as their rationale, and where the smooth side was and where the furred metal side was, we demonstrated that that was false, and that basically eliminated the sniper as one of the claims that the guardsmen could rely on. So it was that kind of reporting, slow, deliberate, checking things out, making sure that we had everything buttoned down before we would. So we held a lot of stories up because we couldn't vet them, we couldn't establish the truth. But once we did, they became a part of the story. One of the big stories that we were able to get came in the middle of July, when we got a copy of the findings of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's investigation of the Kent State shootings, and it basically said the National Guard was at fault. The National Guard did not have to shoot the students; their lives were not endangered as they claimed, and there were other ways to control the student demonstrators. Well, that was a huge blockbuster, and even President Nixon said he wanted to stop the story. Well, of course he couldn't do that. It was all over the country as a bombshell, but it became part of the truthful narrative that resulted from our reporting.
So it seems to me that you had quite a lot of pushback. I know that they reported initially, the national press reported that there was a sniper. That hole, by the way, is still there at Kent State, as far as I know, that you can go and see that actual hole you're talking about, the metal in the metal.
You know, it is a major tourist attraction. And if you go there, there's all kinds of little chalk marks with peace signs and peaceful expressions and so on. In fact, it is the only remaining piece of evidence that there was any shooting that day at all. Everything else is gone. It's picked up bullets and so on. But the bullet hole remains in the sculpture, and it is a huge tourist attraction.
Well, you had pushback. You had the President of the United States not wanting the story to run. You had the National Guard, which is government, trying to push back on this story. I can imagine the pressure you guys were under. But, one of the things I want to talk about is your perspective now. Here we are 50 years later. You've lived a lot of life. You've been managing editor at a lot of other newspapers. You've done a lot of things in journalism, sir. So what's your feel of where we stand today with journalism?
I think journalism is more important today than many other times. The need for truth is so paramount in our society today that we have to support the press. We have to support newspapers. Local news especially is critical. And I know when I'm doing my interviews, I urge people to buy a newspaper, subscribe to a paper, read it, critique it, but support it because it is one of the few outlets that tries to address what's going on in this country and report the truth. You know, newspapers are failing financially in many respects. They're going out of
Yep.
business, or they're, you know, being bought by hedge funds or whatever, cut the size of the staff. But rely on your local newspaper and read it carefully and critically, because in my book I describe several watch guidelines where serious readers can understand how to look at the news and think about it and engage in discussions with their friends and neighbors and call the newspaper, but where you can find ways to analyze news that is truthful and will help you understand and find and depend upon truthful reporting.
Well, that's what we need. I'm curious in your thought, if we talk about national news, it seems to me it's gotten to the point where we have a lot of commentary versus just reporting, not all the time. But certainly it seems that certain newspapers go to the left or go to the right, and it has a bent to it that to me is disheartening. I'm just curious your thought about that.
Well, there is more freedom of reporters in some news organizations to write in ways that convey a point of view. This is very unfortunate.
Yeah.
I am drawn myself in my reading of the news every day, and I read the New York Times because we can get it here in Traverse City. But I read it because I've identified several reporters who write with authority and who rely on their sourcing from people who have expert knowledge. Let's take the virus. You know, in the beginning, there were opinions all over the place. People with screwy ideas were being quoted and given attention in press. And over time, that universe of people that were being paid attention to has narrowed to a small group of experts, people who understand the science, understand the odds, the risks, and who can describe effectively the wonderful work that the medical people in the hospitals are doing. These are the kind of people, this is the kind of reporting that people have to come to rely on, because that's where the truth will end. The truth will become acceptable. And it will, if you read the paper from that point of view, looking for authoritative reporting, reporters who know what they're talking about and who rely on the experts, we're going to get through this with a well-informed public.
Yeah, that makes sense. I personally read the Times, I read the Wall Street Journal, and I read some other things. And I have learned over time to know when I'm getting that bent or that opinion. You know, you see it, and now that I've done it so much, it's like big, huge. It's like an elephant walking across the screen. I read it online. So this big elephant walking across the screen, and I go, oh, this guy has an opinion. This is a commentary. But I like your idea of certain reporters, specific reporters that you can become to trust, of having the facts and doing what really journalism is. In the old days, all the different sources they had to have and really trying to make sure that the truth was pushed forward. It just has become big business. And the point is also that they're going out of business. So one of the things they have to do, I mean, you've been editors at different newspapers. One of the things they have to do, especially with online presence, is make sure they're getting clicks and making sure they're getting lots of stuff. And a lot of times the headlines don't match the actual story. They're just there to get you to click on it. So we have a bit of the financial strains and trying to bring in enough revenue thrown in. I suppose it's always been that way, but it seems probably inflated now just because of all the pressure they have on to make money. Thoughts?
Well, when we were covering Kent State in 1970, we had a big newspaper. We had 150 reporters in a modest-sized town, and on Sunday, we run more than 200 pages, lots of advertising, and so on. But the point was that our readers trusted us. And John S. Knight, who is the owner I referred to earlier, you referred to earlier, had his values were so ingrained in the way the newsroom was run and the way we covered stories that they believed us. They didn't always like the facts that we presented to them, but they respected us because they knew that it was in our stories, we gave them the best available version of the truth. And over time, that created an atmosphere, a culture of trust in our community, so that when Kent State came, our readers believed us, even though they didn't like what the students were demonstrating against. And some of them even went so far as to say of the National Guard, they should have shot them all. I mean, there was that kind of tension in the community, but we stood alone as a believable source of accurate information, and that's what carried us through that long period of examination of what happened and so on, and that's what's reflected in my book.
Well, obviously, freedom of the press is a core pillar in the U.S. Constitution. I agree that it is vital. I'm disappointed in the slant that seems to come from different sides, not even picking one side or the other. I just wish we could have the straight-on reporting that you're talking about, sir. We've been talking to Robert Giles. The book is When Truth Mattered, the Kent State shootings 50 years later. It is an important date, I think, that we should remember. It is a time in our history of this country that was unbelievable, all the way through the Vietnam War and all that happened there. And then, of course, this shooting and the other things that happened. You had Kennedy being assassinated, 2 Kennedys in that decade, and also Martin Luther King. Pretty intense decade. This is at the very end of that decade. And good that we went past that. And we have our own problems today, but I'll just take a step back here and talk to you about it. I appreciate you taking the time to be on. Thank you for at least standing as a pillar of what the reporting was at that point. And I just hope that we can keep journalism with that. I love that. Again, let's go back to that. Get the truth and print it. I mean, that should be on the front page of every instruction booklet for journalism, as far as I'm concerned, because that's really all I'm looking for. So,
John,
sir,
thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you. Be safe in yourself and your listeners, and good luck.
Thank you, sir. Talk to you again soon. Okay, well, there you go. I just wanted to talk to him about the press. You know my feeling on that. Thought you might be interested. This is the Sean Burke Show. You can find more at seanburke.net. You'll get this video on YouTube. You'll also get the podcast out on SoundCloud and iTunes and all sorts of places. And this will be broadcast on WSMN 1590. Thanks very much for listening.